Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to continue looking at this stud 8 or better example that I talked about in a previous video. And you can see here in Google Sheets on the right, I did all of the math for us for some EV calculations of this steal and bring in spot. If you haven't seen my previous video, I'd highly recommend you check that out before you finish this one. There was a bit of a mistake in the first one, which none of you caught in the comments, but of course I didn't catch it either when I wrote it. And the mistake was in the EV calculations in the bottom section for the equity when the bring-in was defending. I've decided to leave the previous video up because the point of the previous video was to talk about the immediate EV of stealing if the bring-in is folding too much. Just as a point of reference, remember something if like the bring-in folds something like 40% of the time, we are plus EV immediately to steal, even if we just throw our hand in the muck if bring-in defends. That was the point of the previous video, and that math was certainly right. Here I've updated everything in the bottom, and you can see that we have the equity for the bring-in versus the stealer in this situation, and we can see the EV calculation for both players, and we can see that it makes sense because these should always add up to 700, which is the amount of dead money that's basically in the pot to start the hand. 600 in antes and the $100 bring-in that's already in play. So we're going to go ahead and use this a little bit today to tinker with and talk about it from the other perspective. So the feedback I got in the comments was, wow, I didn't realize how profitable it was for that 9 last to act to just raise in the dark. I realize now that that might have been my implication, but that's not necessarily something I actually believe in. I know from playing experience that if the bring-in is going to fold too much, which we're seeing here in row 9, if the bring-in is folding at too high of a frequency, then it's fine for that last act player to just steal in the dark. However, if the bring-in plays appropriately, or let's just say extremely stubbornly and folds 0% of the time, we have to remember an important thing here. Even if their equities are 50-50, which they're not, we can see in stud flop draw on the left that they are not. But let's just assume that the equities are 50-50 here. Much of the EV of the situation does still go to the bring-in. This is not doom and gloom for the bring-in. In stud 8 or better, the bring-in is always going to have an equity advantage. And we can see just in a 100% range versus range situation here, the 2 has 51.4. So even if we just use that number range versus range, we can see that of that 700 that's in the pot already, it's the bring-in who's profiting 380 and the stealer who's profiting 320. So both players benefit from this folded to the last to act position. It's important for the bring-in to remember that he has a playability and an equity edge in this situation. He just has to remember to not overfold and make sure that he's not giving all of that EV from the dead money to the stealer. So if we just take a look at from the perspective of the 2, who's the bring-in here, look at all these green squares that are showing high plus EV hands against the bring-in's range. I mean, obviously we have premium hands like aces, 76% hot and cold equity here. We have all these suited like 3 low flush cards, which are very high equity. But even some weaker hands, the only hands that are really not plus EV or not ahead of the stealer's range are these offsuit high combinations and these offsuit high and low combinations. This is the weakest part of the bring-in's range. This middle square kind of rectangle with a jagged edge to it here in the center. Every other hand is actually winning for the bring-in this situation. And I would advocate as the bring-in, if you are playing against someone who's stealing appropriately or possibly too much from the last to act, then the biggest thing you can do is remember you have an equity edge with many of your holdings and you need to be comfortable going ahead and building the pot. I highly recommend playing an aggressive 2-betting strategy out of the bring-in because you have an uncapped range. You have all of the potential premium holdings here. I mean, you can 2-bet a hand like Queen 8 deuce of clubs and have 56% equity. You can 2-bet a hand like Ace 8 deuce rainbow and have 58% equity. These hands are doing very well against the stealer's range. And it's my experience from playing that stealers are not particularly comfortable playing very weak hands in wide range situations. So you probably will even get your opponent to make bigger mistakes later in the hand. And now, one other thing might be, well, you may say to yourself, well, the stealer might not actually be stealing 100% of hands, right? Let's just assume that he's playing a flawed strategy, or he's playing a fine strategy, but it involves only stealing, let's say, the top 50% of hands, right? So let's go ahead and narrow his range, and let's see how our bring-in's range is still doing against this tighter range. Look at what his tighter range is distributed from here. It's suited hands, it's low hands that are suited, it's ace X with low cards, it's big cards, it's split 9. So this is a much stronger, tighter range, 50% of hands. we can see now that the stealer will have an overall hot and cold equity advantage in this situation if he's only stealing with this few of hands. He's now 53%, but he's still only 53%, guys. This is not all doom and gloom for the deuce. Look at how much equity these hands have for the deuce, even against only the top 50% of stealing hands. Now notice that rectangle that we were looking at earlier. It's getting more orange. It's getting worse, right? But look, the worst hands in this range are still 40%. Okay, this one's 37.5%. That's about as bad as I can find. Up 36.5%, 36.3. So, it looks like the worst hands that you can have here as the bring-in are still getting 36% against the stealer's range. Obviously, you might start to argue for a fold with hands that have that low equity, but look at all the hands that are still plus EV against the stealer's range. Notice that these 3-card rainbow ace 8 deuce rainbow hands are still 53% against that stealing range. All the pairs are doing very, very well here. Pocket pairs, any split deuces with a low card are doing fine. Split deuces with an 8 offsuit are 52%. So this is an important chart for you guys to study and spend time thinking about. Realize that your hands have more equity than you typically think in this situation. And it is the bring-in who often has an equity edge in this situation. And he is the one who needs to be playing aggressively back at the stealer. If the stealer is coming in too much, or even at a reasonably appropriate frequency, you can fight back very, very aggressively from the bring-in this situation. Look at this EV calculation on the right and realize that even when the bring-in only has something like 42% equity, or sorry, this is the equity for the stealer. So the bring-in only has something like, 42% would be the opposite of 58 here. He still has a substantial amount of EV in this pot, $288 out of the $700. You are throwing that away way too easily, giving too much credit to your opponent's stealing range when equities run close in stud 8 or better. And you really, really need to get more comfortable defending and 2-betting with weaker hands to fight back in the situation so that you can be more competitive and make sure you're not giving away the equity that last act player is trying to steal. And one final thought from the stealer's point of view, remember this 9 that we've talked about. Here he's only playing 50% of hands. He probably can just raise this entire range. If the bring-in starts playing more appropriately, if the bring-in watches my channel and starts to play good poker, the 9 cannot raise in the dark. The 9, what I would recommend the 9 do is limp a lot. One thing about limping is that it doesn't reopen the action. The 2 cannot 2-bet his best hands. Yes, the 9 is completely capped when he does this. He only has weak holdings. But guess what? He's getting 7-1. Remember, just to limp, he only needs 12.5% equity hot and cold to limp here to be plus EV. So when you're last to act here, you could play pretty transparently. You can limp with weak hands, and if you catch a good card on 4th Street, if you just catch a pair, now you've got something. If the bring-in catches a bad card and seems disinterested, maybe now you go for a delayed steal. But you don't have to try to make something happen. When you're getting 7-1 in limit poker, you're not expecting to win the pot very often. You're just trying to get your fair share, which is not very frequent here. You only need 12.5%. So there's a lot to consider in this last act situation from the bring-in and the stealer, but hopefully this sheds a little bit more light on how I actually view the situation. The last act does not get to raise in the dark, but he probably doesn't get to fold either in theory, and the bring-in has the equity advantage and can be very aggressive. So let me know what new questions this brings up for you. Let me know if there's anything you'd want me to go into in deeper detail in these sort of situations, because this is a very, very common spot in mixed game tournaments, in stud 8 in particular, and we can look at some examples in future videos for stud high and Raz, which will be a little bit different because obviously now the bring-in does have a disadvantage, but there is still a lot of dead money in the pot, and playing as the bring-in and making sure you're not giving up too much EV to a late position stealer is a very, very important concept in stud games to be playing tough. So see you guys in the comments. Let me know what questions this brings for you, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks.